The planet Verith, 9 sat at the far edge of explored space, a dry and rocky world where the wind never really stopped blowing. It was not a beautiful place. The sky was a pale orange color, and the ground was covered in flat gray stone. There were no oceans, no forests, and no cities that belonged to humans. There was only the outpost, a collection of metal buildings, walkways, and generator towers that had been built a few years ago when the Galactic Council decided that humans and several other alien species needed a place to talk to each other. The outpost was called Relay Point 7. Most people just called it the Relay. About 400 beings lived there at any given time. Some were diplomats. Some were scientists. Some were soldiers or guards. And some, like Calvin Oates, were just there to keep everything running. Calvin was 34 years old. He was not tall, not short, and not the kind of person anyone noticed when he walked into a room. He had short brown hair, slightly dirty hands most of the time, and a habit of wearing the same gray work jacket every single day. He had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where people fixed their own trucks and did not ask for much. He had volunteered for the frontier posting because a recruiter told him the relay needed a skilled mechanic and the pay was decent. He had not thought much further than that. His job was simple. He kept the machines working. The generators, the water recyclers, the heating systems, the transport vehicles, the loading lifts. If it had moving parts and needed power, it was his responsibility. He was good at his job. He showed up early, stayed late, and never complained. Most people at the relay did not know his name. They just knew that when something broke, it got fixed. On the morning that everything changed, Calvin was not supposed to be anywhere near the main hall. He had gotten a notification around sunrise that one of the coolant lines running beneath the east wing of the building was leaking. It was a slow leak, not dangerous yet, but if he left it, it would get worse. He grabbed his toolkit, followed the line along the floor of a maintenance corridor, and ended up crouching beneath a ventilation shaft just behind the main hall's back wall. That was when he heard the ceremony begin. He had known the bonding ceremony was happening today. Everyone at the relay had known. The Verith, the dragon species who had lived on this planet long before humans arrived, held bonding ceremonies when a clutch of eggs hatched. It was one of the most sacred things in their culture. A Verith hatchling, upon breaking out of its egg, would look out at the gathered crowd and walk toward the one it chose. That person, whoever they were, became the hatchling's bonded companion for life. The bond was not just emotional. According to everything the xenobiology team had recorded, it was something deeper, something that worked on a level science had not fully explained yet. Calvin had heard all of this in briefings. He had nodded along the way he always did and then gone back to his work. It had nothing to do with him. He finished tightening the coolant line connector and sat back on his heels. The leak had stopped. He started packing his tools slowly, listening to the sounds coming through the wall. There were voices, calm, ceremonial voices speaking in the Verith tongue, which sounded like low rumbling mixed with high clicking sounds. Then there was a long silence. Then the sound of something small moving across a stone floor. He was curious. He should have gone back to the maintenance corridor. Instead, he stood up and walked around to the side door of the main hall, which had been left slightly open for ventilation. The hall was large and lit with warm amber light. Rows of beings stood along the walls, Verith elders in their ceremonial dark robes, human diplomats in their formal jackets, a few figures from 2 other species whose names Calvin could never quite remember. In the center of the floor, 6 broken eggshells sat in a wide stone ring. 5 hatchlings had already moved. They stood beside 5 chosen companions, each one pressing its small snout against the hand or leg of its person. The companions looked stunned and grateful and a little tearful. The 6th hatchling stood alone in the middle of the ring. It was smaller than the others. Its scales were gray, not the deep green or blue that the other hatchlings had. One of its 2 small horns grew slightly crooked, bending just a little to the left. It had hatched last, and it was now standing very still, looking out at the crowd with wide orange eyes. Nobody moved toward it. Calvin watched from the doorway. He saw the hatchling turn its head slowly, looking from one side of the room to the other. He saw the Verith elders begin to murmur among themselves. He saw one of them step forward slightly, as if preparing to end the ceremony and remove the hatchling. He did not decide to step forward. He just did it. His feet moved before his brain had any say in the matter. He walked through the side door and into the hall, and every pair of eyes in the room turned to look at him. He was still holding his wrench. His jacket had a coolant stain on the left sleeve. The hatchling heard him and turned. They looked at each other across the stone floor. The hatchling took one small step toward him. Then another. Calvin crouched down slowly, the way he did when he was looking at something close to the ground, and he set his wrench down beside him. The hatchling walked the rest of the way across the floor and sat down directly in front of him. It looked up at him with those orange eyes. And then something happened that Calvin could not describe afterward, not exactly. It was like a door opened somewhere he had not known was there. Quiet and certain and very still. The room was completely silent. One of the elder Verith made a sound, low and sharp, like the beginning of an objection. But no one finished the sound. No one said anything at all. Calvin looked at the hatchling. The hatchling looked at him. And in the amber light of the ceremony hall on a dry and windy planet at the edge of explored space, something that had been alone for its first few minutes of life was alone no longer. The first person to speak to Calvin after the ceremony was Lorraine Voss. She was the head human diplomat at the relay, a tall woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a way of speaking that made every sentence sound like a decision that had already been made. She found him in the corridor outside the main hall less than 10 minutes after everything happened, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a broken pipe, not angry exactly, but very tired. She told him that what had just happened was complicated. She told him that the Verith elders were already in a private meeting and that the other diplomatic teams were sending messages to their home offices. She told him to say nothing to anyone, stay out of sight, and let her manage the situation. Calvin said he understood. He picked up his tool bag and walked back to his workshop at the far end of the south wing. The hatchling walked with him. The workshop was the room Calvin spent most of his time in. It smelled like oil and metal and the faint chemical sting of welding flux. There were long workbenches covered in parts, a row of tool cabinets along one wall, and a cleared corner near the heating vent where Calvin kept a folding chair and sometimes ate his lunch. The room was not beautiful, but it was comfortable in the way that rooms are when someone has spent a lot of honest hours in them. The hatchling stepped inside and immediately stopped moving. It stood at the edge of the doorway and looked at everything with those wide orange eyes. Its small nostrils flared slowly, taking in all the smells. Then it walked carefully to the nearest workbench, stretched its neck up to see what was on top of it, and looked at a disassembled pump valve for a long moment before looking back at Calvin. Calvin did not know what to do. He had no idea how to take care of a dragon hatchling. He did not know what they ate or how much they slept or what they needed. He stood in the middle of his workshop and felt genuinely lost, which was not a feeling he had often. He did the only thing he could think of. He sat down on the floor. The hatchling watched him. Then it walked over and sat down a few feet away, still watching. Calvin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small container of food he had brought for his own lunch, a wrapped piece of flatbread with some protein paste. He opened it and broke off a small corner and set it on the floor between them. The hatchling sniffed it carefully. Then it ate it. Then it looked at him as if waiting to see what would happen next. That was how the first day went. Calvin named him Pip. He was not sure where the name came from exactly. It just seemed to fit. Small, simple, and easy to say. Pip did not react to the name at first, but by the end of the second day he was turning his head when Calvin said it, and by the end of the third day he was walking over. Word spread through the relay quickly, the way word always does in a small community with nothing else to talk about. Some people were curious and walked past the workshop trying to look in through the window. Some people thought the whole thing was funny. The soldiers and guards generally thought it was embarrassing for some reason they could not fully explain. The xenobiology team thought it was extraordinary, and at least 2 of them had already started writing notes. The one who actually came and knocked on the workshop door was Nora Kim. She was 29, a xenobiology researcher who had been at the relay for about a year studying Verith communication patterns. She was not very tall, wore her hair pulled back, and had a habit of carrying a small recording device in her shirt pocket. She knocked on the door, said her name, and asked politely if she could come in and observe. Calvin thought about it for a moment and said yes. Nora came in and sat on a stool near the wall and watched Pip explore the workshop for about 40 minutes without saying much. She made notes. She watched Calvin work on a broken filtration unit while Pip sat nearby, watching every move Calvin's hands made with deep and serious attention. Before she left, she said, "He is growing faster than the others." Calvin looked up. "Is that normal?" Nora said she did not know yet. She said she would come back tomorrow if that was all right. Calvin said it was. 3 days after the ceremony, a formal delegation of Verith elders arrived at the workshop. There were 4 of them, in their dark robes, moving with the slow and deliberate weight of beings who had lived for a very long time. The one who spoke was the oldest, Elder Soreth, a Verith so ancient that the scales on his face had faded from dark green to a pale gray silver. He looked at Calvin the way someone looks at something unexpected, not with hostility, but with the particular attention of a person who is trying to understand something that does not fit neatly into any category they already have. He said that the Council of Elders had not yet ruled on the validity of the bond. He said that the matter would be reviewed. He said that until a decision was made, the hatchling was to remain in Calvin's care, as removing it by force could cause harm to both the hatchling and the bonded human. Calvin said he understood. Soreth looked at Pip, who was sitting on the workbench near a row of sorted bolts that he had been examining one by one. Pip looked back at Soreth with calm, steady eyes. Soreth said nothing else. He turned and walked out with the other elders, and Calvin did not see him again for several weeks. But Pip was already different from the hatchling who had stood alone in the stone ring. He ate well. He slept curled near the heating vent. He spent long hours watching Calvin work, and he had started doing something that Calvin noticed but could not quite name. He was paying attention. Not the way a pet pays attention to its owner, waiting for food or play. He was paying attention the way someone does when they are trying to learn something. One evening, Pip picked up a small bolt from the floor with his front claws and turned it over several times, examining it. Then he carried it to the exact spot on the bench where Calvin always put sorted bolts of that size. He set it down and looked at Calvin. Calvin looked at the bolt. Then he looked at Pip. Then he said, simply and honestly, "Good job." Pip made a small sound, low and soft, like the beginning of a purr, and went back to looking at the next bolt on the floor. Calvin sat back in his chair and thought that he did not know much about dragon hatchlings, but he was beginning to think that Pip was going to be all right. 3 months passed. The relay continued its slow diplomatic work. Treaties were discussed. Trade agreements were drafted and redrafted. Species that did not fully trust each other sat across tables and tried to find common ground while their assistants took careful notes. None of it had much to do with Calvin, who spent his days in the South Wing workshop keeping the outposts machines in order. Pip grew. Not slowly the way hatchlings were supposed to grow, according to every Verith record Nora Kim had access to. Pip grew at almost twice the normal rate. By the end of the first month he was the size of a large dog. By the end of the second month he was as long as a work table. By the end of the third month he was big enough that when he stretched out in the workshop he took up most of the floor space, and Calvin had to walk carefully around him. Nora came to the workshop almost every day now. She recorded everything. She measured Pip's length and the span of his wings and the growth of his horns, including the crooked one on the left, which had not straightened but had grown longer and now looked less like a mistake and more like a feature. She ran cognitive tests designed for Verith hatchlings, the kind that tested memory and pattern recognition and problem-solving ability. Pip scored higher than any hatchling on record for his age group. Not a little higher. A lot higher. She sat down with Calvin one afternoon and spread her notes across the workbench and told him what she was finding. "His emotional stability scores are the highest I have ever seen in a hatchling," she said. "His problem-solving speed is roughly 3 times the age-expected average. And his attachment readings, the way his bonding response registers, it does not look like a normal Verith bond." Calvin looked at the numbers without saying much for a moment. "Is that bad?" "No," Nora said. "It is different. Most Verith bonds work on a hierarchy. The companion is above the dragon. The dragon serves. Pip's bond does not read like that. It reads more like," she paused and looked at her notes, "like something between equals." Calvin thought about this. He did not say anything particularly wise in response. He said, and went back to tightening a bolt on the water pump he was working on. But Pip, who had been lying nearby pretending to be asleep, opened one orange eye and looked at Nora with an expression she later described in her notes as thoughtful. The difference in the way Calvin worked with Pip was hard to describe in official language, but Nora had been trying. Calvin did not give Pip commands. He talked to Pip while he worked, the same way some people talk to themselves, out loud, without expecting an answer, just thinking through what he was doing. This bearing is worn down, that is why the shaft is vibrating. If I reroute the secondary line here, it will take pressure off the main valve. Pip listened to all of it with intense focus. When Pip made a mistake, and he did make mistakes, pulling apart things he was not supposed to pull apart, accidentally knocking over trays of sorted parts, Calvin did not react with frustration. He looked at what had happened, figured out if anything was damaged, fixed what needed fixing, and explained to Pip what had gone wrong. Not in a scolding way. In the same calm voice he used for everything else. Pip had started doing something new in the past few weeks. When Calvin was working on something complicated, Pip would bring him tools. Not randomly, the right tools at roughly the right time. He had watched long enough to understand the sequence of things. He could not grip most tools the way human hands could, but he found ways. He pushed things with his snout, carried lighter items in his front claws, used his tail to slide things across the floor. One morning Pip disassembled a hydraulic valve completely, every small piece laid out in the correct order on the bench, and then reassembled it without any help. Calvin had not asked him to do it. Pip had simply picked it up, started working, and finished. The valve worked correctly when Calvin tested it afterward. Pip was 4 months old. Nora published a preliminary research paper and sent it to 6 institutions. The response was immediate and loud. 3 xenobiology departments asked for more data. 2 alien research teams contacted the relay requesting observation access. A professor from a university on Earth sent a very long message that used the word unprecedented 4 times. This attention was not entirely welcome. It was around this time that Commander Drathkoval arrived at the relay. Drath was a Verith military commander, powerful, decorated, and deeply certain of himself. He was tall even by Verith standards, with dark blue-green scales and the kind of bearing that came from spending decades being the most important person in every room he entered. He came officially as part of a military advisory visit. Anyone paying attention could see that he was there because of Pip. He was not subtle about his feelings. In a diplomatic dinner his second evening at the relay, he made comments within earshot of several people about the damage being done to Verith culture by allowing sacred bonds to be formed carelessly. He used the word carelessly while looking across the room in the general direction of the south wing. He came to the workshop 2 days after arriving. Calvin was outside doing maintenance on one of the transport vehicles. Pip was sitting on top of the vehicle watching him work. Drath walked up with 2 junior officers and looked at Pip for a long moment with an expression that was very close to contempt. He said something in the Verith tongue, directed at Pip. Calvin did not speak Verith, but Nora told him later that it had been a challenge phrase, something warriors said to young dragons to test their spirit, designed to provoke a reaction. Pip looked at Drath. Then Pip looked at Calvin. Then Pip lay down slowly on top of the vehicle and put his head on his front claws. Drath's expression shifted, though he controlled it quickly. He looked at Calvin. Calvin was still holding his wrench. He looked back at Drath with quiet and steady eyes and said nothing at all for a moment. Then he said simply, "He is not going anywhere." Drath left without responding. That evening, Nora told Calvin that Drath had filed a formal challenge with the Galactic Council, questioning whether a non-warrior human could hold a legitimate Verith bond. A hearing had been scheduled. Calvin was quiet for a while after she told him. Then he went back to finishing his dinner. Pip climbed under the workbench, turned in a circle twice, and curled up to sleep. His tail, which was now quite long, wound loosely around the leg of Calvin's chair. The Galactic Council chamber was not on Verith 9. It was on a large station in the middle of a system that no single species claimed, which was the whole point. Everything inside it was built to accommodate as many different kinds of beings as possible. The ceilings were high, the lighting was adjustable, and the air systems could be set to different mixes depending on who was sitting where. It was the kind of place that tried very hard to be neutral and mostly succeeded. Calvin had never been there before. He arrived on a transport shuttle wearing the best clothes he owned, which were a clean gray jacket and dark pants without visible stains. Lorraine Voss had offered once more to speak on his behalf, using a tone that made it clear she considered this the sensible option. Calvin had thanked her politely and declined again. He was allowed to bring Pip. This had been a condition he had stated simply and without room for negotiation. Either Pip comes or I do not come. The council had agreed after some discussion. Pip walked into the chamber beside Calvin, his scales gleaming in the adjusted lighting, his crooked horn catching the light at an angle that made it look almost intentional. He was now large enough that his shoulder came up to Calvin's hip. 7 species were represented on the council panel. They sat in a curved arrangement behind a long raised surface, looking down at the floor where Calvin stood. Drath Koval sat to one side with his legal representatives, all of them in formal military dress. Elder Sorath was also present, seated separately in an observer's position. He had said nothing to Calvin when they arrived, only looked at him once with those pale, ancient eyes. The hearing began with a formal reading of the challenge, that the bond formed between Calvin Oates, a civilian mechanic with no combat training, no noble lineage, and no formal standing in Verith culture, could not be considered a valid Verith bond under traditional law. Drath's representatives argued that the bonding ceremony existed within a cultural and social framework that required a companion of appropriate status. A mechanic, they said, could not fulfill the role. Then it was Calvin's turn to speak. He stood in the center of the chamber floor. He did not have notes. He had thought about what to say on the long shuttle ride over and had eventually stopped thinking about it because he kept coming up with things that sounded too formal and not quite true. He talked about Pip. He started at the beginning, the first days in the workshop, when Pip would not eat unless Calvin sat on the floor near him. He talked about how he had figured out that Pip slept better when there was a low mechanical hum nearby, so he had left a small motor running on the low shelf by Pip's sleeping spot every night for the first 2 weeks. He talked about the day Pip had first sorted bolts by size on his own, and the day he had disassembled and correctly reassembled the hydraulic valve, and the way Pip had started anticipating what tool Calvin would need next. He talked about it the way he talked about most things, plainly, without trying to make it sound larger than it was. One of the council members, a being from a species Calvin did not know the name of, asked him why he had stepped forward at the bonding ceremony. Calvin was quiet for a moment. He looked at Pip, who was sitting very still just behind him and to the left. He said, "Because nobody else did." And he was right there. And he looked scared. The chamber was quiet for a few seconds after that. Drath's representatives conducted their cross-examination. They were thorough. They asked about Calvin's military record. He had none. His academic training, a technical certificate from a community college. His knowledge of Verith bonding traditions, limited to what he had read in briefing documents. His social standing at the relay, he was a rank-and-file civilian maintenance worker. Calvin agreed with everything they said. He did not try to argue any of it. Yes, he had no combat training. Yes, he had no noble lineage. Yes, he had learned about bonding from briefing documents, not from years of cultural study. Yes, he was a mechanic who fixed water recyclers and generator parts for a living. One of Drath's representatives asked him, with clear scorn in their voice, whether he thought a person with those qualifications had any business being bonded to a Verith dragon. Calvin thought about it seriously for a moment. Then he said he was not sure what the right qualifications were supposed to be. He said he did not know much about bonding traditions. He said he knew that Pip had been standing alone, and that he had walked over, and that whatever happened after that had not felt like a mistake to him. Not then and not now. Then Elder Sorath was asked to give testimony. The old Verith rose slowly and walked to the center of the chamber floor with the deliberate pace of someone who had done difficult things for a very long time and was not in any hurry. He stood quietly for a moment before speaking. He said he had observed the bond between Calvin Oates and the hatchling called Pip over the course of 3 months. He said he had watched them every day, sometimes from outside the workshop window, sometimes from the corridor, sometimes from nearby when Calvin was doing exterior maintenance. He talked about a specific afternoon in the 2nd month. Pip had climbed up onto a fuel storage tank to look at something on top of it and had slipped. He had fallen about 2 meters and landed badly on his left shoulder, letting out a sharp cry. Calvin had been across the yard and had crossed it at a run. He had crouched down beside Pip, checked the injury, determined that nothing was broken, and then Sorath paused, sat down on the ground, right there in the yard, and held Pip until the shaking stopped. Not quickly. Not impatiently. He sat there for a long time. He did not check the time. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching. He just sat with Pip until Pip was calm. Sorath looked at the council. He said, "I have watched Vareth bonds for 140 years. A hatchling that is unchosen carries a wound in its spirit. I have never in all those years seen that wound heal. This one has healed." He returned to his seat without saying anything more. The council voted after a short recess. The bond was upheld. The challenge was dismissed. Drathkoval stood, looked at Pip across the chamber for a long moment, and then walked out. Pip looked back at him calmly, without moving, without flinching at all. On the shuttle back to Vareth, 9, Calvin sat with his eyes closed and Pip lying against his side, warm and heavy and steady. Calvin did not feel like he had won something. He felt like he had explained something true, and the people listening had understood it, and that was all it had ever needed to be. 6 months after the bonding ceremony, the relay was a slightly different place. Not loudly different. Not the kind of different that gets announced or celebrated. Just different the way things get when something real has shifted quietly underneath everything else. Pip was now the size of a small transport vehicle. He had grown long and broad across the shoulders, with wings that he could not yet fully open indoors. His scales had deepened from gray to a dark silver-blue color that caught the light in a way that made the xenobiology team want to take photographs. His crooked horn had grown long enough that it no longer looked crooked. It had its own shape now, distinct and particular, like something that had been made that way on purpose. He had taken over most of the workshop. There was simply no other option. Calvin had rearranged the whole room, pushed the workbenches against the walls, hung tools on vertical racks to save floor space, and cleared a wide area near the far wall where Pip slept on a thick padded surface that the relay supply team had ordered from a freight catalog without anyone asking them to. They had just done it, quietly, which Calvin had thought was kind. Pip was helping with repairs now. Not in a dramatic way. He could not use most human tools precisely, but he had developed his own approaches. He held large parts steady with his body while Calvin worked. He used his tail to hold light sources at angles Calvin could not manage alone. He had figured out how to press a specific type of release valve with his snout better than any wrench could, and Calvin had started saving that step in any repair job specifically for him. They worked together smoothly, in a rhythm that had developed the way all good working rhythms develop, slowly and without discussion, through repetition and small adjustments, until it felt natural. Nora's research paper had now been sent to 12 institutions and cited in 4 separate galactic-level academic publications. She had been asked to speak at a conference. She was preparing a second paper. She came to the workshop often, but less to observe and more just to sit and think, which Calvin understood and did not mind. The second bonding ceremony happened on a morning in the 7th month. A new clutch of eggs had hatched from a different Vareth family's nest on the far side of the settlement. 6 eggs again. This time, 3 hatchlings went unchosen by the end of the ceremony. The Vareth elders stood in their places, and the gathered crowd was quiet, and 3 small dragons stood alone in the stone ring the same way Pip had stood alone 7 months before. 3 humans stepped forward. One was a cook from the relay kitchen named Gary Pell, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s who had worked food service on frontier postings for 15 years. One was a communications officer named Diane Morse, who was 26 and had been at the relay for 8 months. The third was an engineering trainee named Dale Ford, 19 years old, who had arrived at the relay only 2 months ago and was technically still in his orientation period. There was a stir in the crowd. There was discussion. There were some objections from the traditional faction among the Vareth observers. But the stir was smaller than the one that had followed Calvin's bonding. The precedent existed now. The council had ruled. The world had not ended. By the end of the day, 3 new bonds had formed, and 3 hatchlings that might have been cast out were not. Calvin heard about it second-hand from Nora, who came to the workshop that evening looking quietly moved. He listened to her describe what had happened, and then he nodded, and then he went back to the water recycler he was working on. Pip, who had been listening from his spot near the wall, made a low sound that Nora said later she could not find the right word for. It was not quite a growl and not quite a hum. It was something in between, something that seemed to come from deep in his chest, like a sound a very old bell makes when it is struck for the first time in a long while. A message arrived from the Galactic Council 2 weeks later. It was addressed formally to Calvin Oates, Civilian Maintenance Technician, Relay Point 7. It informed him that a new interspecies bonding research committee was being formed and that his name had been submitted as a potential contributing member. The committee would study bonding compatibility across species lines and make recommendations to the Council on bonding law reform. Calvin read the message. He read it a second time. He set it on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his wrench and went back to the water recycler. He thought he would probably respond to it later. He was not sure what he would say yet. Elder Soreth came to the workshop the following morning. He came alone, which was unusual. He moved slowly through the door and stood inside for a moment, taking in the space, the tools on the walls, the padded floor area where Pip slept, the smell of oil and metal that had soaked into every surface over years of honest work. Pip was awake and watching from his sleeping spot. He did not get up, but he tracked Soreth with calm, steady eyes. Calvin set down what he was doing and waited. Soreth said that in Verith tradition, there was a title given to the one who bonded with the last hatched of a clutch. It was very old, he said. Older than most of the current traditions. It translated roughly as the one who sees what others pass by. He said it had never been a grand title. It had not been given to warriors or nobles or diplomats. It had been given, across Verith history, to the ones who found the overlooked eggs, the eggs left in rubble after storms, the eggs forgotten in abandoned nests, the eggs that everyone else had already walked past. He said he had not thought, when he was young, that he would live long enough to see the title given to a human. He said he found that he did not mind. Calvin did not know what to say to that. He thought about saying thank you and decided it was not quite the right response. He thought about saying he did not deserve a title and decided that was not quite true either. He said nothing for a moment, and Soreth did not seem to need him to. The old Verith looked at Pip one more time. Pip looked back at him with those orange eyes, calm and clear and entirely without fear. Soreth made a small sound, very quiet, that sounded like acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked out the door and back into the pale orange morning. Calvin looked at Pip. Pip climbed out from his sleeping spot, stretched his long body, and walked over to Calvin. He looked up at him for a moment. Then he made a sound, a specific sound, one that Nora had noted in her research files and flagged because it did not appear in any standard Verith vocabulary list. She had written in her notes that the closest translation she could find, after consulting 3 Verith language scholars, was something like, "I knew, even when I did not know." Calvin scratched Pip behind his crooked horn, the way he had been doing since Pip was small enough to sit on a workbench. Then the water recycler hummed back to life, which meant the repair had held. Calvin checked the pressure reading, noted it in his log, and picked up the next work order from the pile on the bench. Pip settled beside him, his long tail curling loosely around the leg of Calvin's chair, and waited to see what they would fix next.